Well, welcome everybody as we begin tonight's webinar on the 39-hour walk, or as I call it, the march, the long march through the Naga Hills. We're really pleased to have well over 100 people registered tonight, possibly even more because they were yesterday's numbers. Lots of friends from around the world, people who have been with us before, and a few new faces as well. So we're very pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which will be presented in the main by Charlotte Carty, one of our trustees, and the author of this crazy long march through the Naga Hills. When I agreed to do it, I didn't think it would actually come off, but of course, pride being what it is, I had to complete it as well. And I'm well and truly healed physically anyway. The mental scars will last a very long time. Okay, so that's all from me. Nice to see everyone joining. I'm going to hand over now to Sylvia May, our Chief Executive. Sylvia.
Thank you, Rob, and hello and welcome everyone to another Kohima Educational Trust webinar. We've had a fantastically busy time since we've last been on air together, and as you will hear tonight, many of us were in Kohima for a couple of weeks, after which the KET caravan then went on to the National Army Museum, where we enjoyed 2 days of fantastic talks over the whole of last weekend. Rob Lyman treated us to his greatest battles and greatest general talks, which were both superb, and I have to admit I hadn't heard before, and they were just wonderful. And on Saturday evening, he interviewed Mark and Mary Ann Slim about their grandfather, General Bill Slim, which was a particular highlight. James Holland also gave his usual top performance, and Fergal Keane kindly, having been called away to Israel by the BBC, he kindly recorded his talk, and which we were able to show and hosted brilliantly by, again, Rob Lyman and Michael Shibster. All of the talks I've just mentioned have been recorded, and hopefully they'll be available to view on our website very soon. But tonight belongs to Charlotte Carty, who orchestrated and completed herself a 77-mile walk in her grandfather's footsteps from Jessami to Kohima, 80 years to the very day, completing it in well under 35 hours. They'd allowed 39. Charlotte's grandfather was Colonel Bruno Brown, who commanded the 1st Assam at Kohima. But immediately prior to the siege, he had been in Jessami, which had to be evacuated in a hurry. He and his men marched to Kohima, arriving 39 hours later, hours before the Japanese began their attack. As always, Robert Lyman is here, who, as he's already said, also did the walk. Chapeau to all of them. I tell you, it was an epic walk. I was nowhere near it. I drove it 2 months earlier, but I couldn't have walked it. I anticipate a fairly lively chat this evening. Please do use the chat button, and I am very pleased to hand over to both Rob and Charlotte. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and again, a very warm welcome from me. We're delighted to have you here tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing Charlotte again talk about the 39-hour walk. Charlotte, of course, regaled us with this story on Sunday afternoon at the National Army Museum, and it was very special. Extraordinarily, at the end of the 2 days of our Kohima Memorial Weekend, we had 100 people in the room, which is quite extraordinary. Particularly those of us who had walked the 39-hour march, or 39-hour walk, long march as I'm calling it, and who had recovered from their privations. It really was an extraordinary event, and we are hugely grateful to Charlotte for coming up with the idea, and even more than that, prosecuting the idea through to its eventual conclusion, which really means 20 of us putting on our walking boots and walking 3 marathons consecutively, non-stop, from Jessami to Kohima to replicate this quite extraordinary withdrawal of her grandfather's battalion from Jessami in 1944. Before I hand over to Charlotte, I just want to remind everyone what an extraordinary defense of Jessami and Karasom the Assams put up. It was very significant strategically. And the defense of Jessami and Karasom, combined with Sato's pig-headedness and his determination to seek battle, gave time to the defenders of Kohima. not merely to prepare, but to degrade the Japanese. And I think as you hear Charlotte's talk, just bear in mind that the young men of the Assam Regiment, men from right across the Assamese hills as they were then, not only fought at Jessami and Karasan, but withdrew the 78 miles to Kohima in good order. Many of them actually threw away their hobnail boots, and I thought about throwing away my boots at one stage. But they got back to Kohima in very good order on the afternoon of the 3rd of May, and they ended up taking positions on Jail Hill, the southernmost or topmost part of Kohima Ridge, which they defended from members of the Japanese 138th Regiment. Incidentally and interestingly, the same regiment they'd been fighting at Karasan, certainly for those Assam Regiment soldiers who'd been at Karasan. So there's a whole circle of violence here that is important to understand. And bear that in mind as Charlotte takes us through her talk on this quite extraordinary adventure. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you. I hope my screen is sharing with you happily.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, unbelievable. 39-hour. Thank you. And thank you, Rob, for doing it. Thank you, Sylvia, for being there with us. It was a silly idea, but a brilliant one. And unbelievably, we did it. And it was so worth it in so many ways. It really was. You've actually heard why we were coming up with this. Well, I came up with this idea, walking my grandfather's footsteps. My grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Bruno Brown, he was at a small village called Jessami in March 1944, and he had to withdraw into the perimeter at Kohima. I vaguely knew about this story, having read the book that had been beside my mother's bed for all the time that I remember. It was the Assam Regimental History, and I probably picked it up when I was in my late teens or possibly in my early 20s. And I read a little bit about what the Assam Regiment seemed to have achieved. It seemed improbable and impossible when I was reading it on the page, very difficult to understand. And so little was written about the Forgotten Army, and this is a time of pre-internet. So I found it fascinating, but I found it hard to believe. I went on and was doing other things in my life and started returning to this story a little bit later, when there was a bit more internet, as we were approaching the 75th anniversary of the battle. And I tried to learn more, but it was hard to find anything, because not just is it a forgotten army, but the Assam Regiment was a British Indian army, and post-independence, an awful lot of the information stayed in India. So it was even harder to find the information. Thankfully, I happened across the Kohima Educational Trust, and I spoke to Sylvia and Rob and said, is this book mythical? Is this real? Were the Assam Regiment there? They said, yes, they were. And it's fantastic to have somebody bringing this side of the story as well. They mentioned that there was a tour going out around the 75th anniversary, so not part of the actual commemorations, being led by another one of the trustees, Bob Cook. And so I persuaded my brother and sister to come out, because I wanted to see on the ground what it was that the Assam Regiment had achieved, because it seems so unlikely when you read the book that they could have achieved this. And I was hoping that when we stood there, it would make more sense. But as I stood on a ridge, looking out beyond ridge after ridge after ridge of beautiful hills, interlocking spurs all the way out to literally the horizon, I remember thinking to myself, I have no idea how they did that. How did they get back over that distance from Jessami to Kohima within the time that is set out in the war diaries and Colonel Richards's remembrances of the battle? Over that distance, over the Naga Hills, which are some of the most misnamed hills of all. I mean, they are very large hills, mountains, I think I would call them. And it seemed even less possible to me that they could do it. But came back from an extraordinary holiday. It was lovely. When we entered COVID, and it was during lockdown that I was contemplating the British government's response to the COVID crisis. And I started thinking about what the wartime generation would make of how we were coping. And then I started thinking back on the lovely holiday that I'd just had over in India and how the Assam had done this remarkable thing. And then I started wondering whether people like me today, would be able to even embark upon something that the Assam Regiment did, us being perhaps significantly softer, not had perhaps the deprivations and the challenges that their generations had. And so it was that idea that I went wandering down the stairs. I had my 3 children at home with me. They were downstairs, and I went down and I said, what do you think about this idea I've got about trying to recreate Grandfather's Walk? And bless them, with one voice, with no irony at all, with one accord, they said, do we have a choice? And I said, well, yes, but thankfully they did want to do it, which was great. So they came along. I mentioned it to Rob again. Now he's let it slip, but he didn't think it would ever come off. But he said yes, so I thought, crikey, better get on then if he's going to come. He loved the idea that the children would come in because I wanted to make sure that the next generation had the opportunity to remember. We're losing so many of these veterans. I felt it was really important that the next generation could hear these stories as close as possible to the sort of real time, as it were. And he thought that was a marvelous idea, and he thought he would try and persuade some of his, perhaps one of his sons, to come with him, which he did. He mentioned it to a couple of other people, and so the snowball started continuing. I thought, right, got to organise a walk in Northeast India. I don't know how to do that, but I do know somebody who can. And I got hold of a gentleman who helped me sort out a trip at very short notice to the area, Bertie Alexander of Sampan Travel, who was amazing and just so positive, and never anything too difficult for him. No curveball was too curvy. He was just wonderful, and he said, yeah, I can do that. And he did. And my goodness me, the logistics that he put together to support this were phenomenal. It was flawless. He was amazing. And he and his team should not be thanked enough. They could not be thanked enough. They are just amazing. And one of the lovely things, oh, it's not going to go to the next page. Let's see. I may have to share my screen again, everyone. I'm so sorry. I'm going to stop sharing, go back the way I was going to do it. And let's hope that it does what I want it to do. Oh no. That's not what I wanted it to happen.
Charlotte, if you do that again, then go down to the bottom left-hand side of the screen and you'll see the little arrows when you hover on them.
Yes.
You should be able to find the little arrow there.
It should. It was there, but then it's just disappeared on me again. Ah, there it is.
There it is.
And this, thank you, Rob. And this is what one of the amazing things that Bertie was able to produce for us, this map about how we were going to do this ridiculous walk. Oh, now it does it. This ridiculous walk, moving from Jessami all the way back to the Kohima, into the Kohima War Cemetery, where we wanted to end the walk. It's 77 miles. It's about 5,300 meters of elevation. And it's very twisty, it's very hilly, and we wanted to try to replicate it in the time exactly that my grandfather's regiment did, which was in 39 hours, leaving at midnight on the night of between the 1st and the 2nd of April, so midnight on the 1st of April into the 2nd of April, to arrive back in the Kohima War Cemetery at 3 p.m. or by 3 p.m. on the 3rd of April. And so that's what we did. But one of the questions you might have is what the Assam were doing out at Jessami in the first place. So a very potted history of the Assam Regiment. They were raised in 1941 to counter the growing threat from the east, Japan, and the Japanese army beginning to threaten and start their move in further west. And they were raised under Colonel Howman. They were raised in 1941, June 1941, and the first commanding officer was Colonel Ross Howman, sitting in the centre here. His second in command, the gentleman sitting to his right, to our left, the smaller gentleman, is my grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Brown, or Major Brown as he was at the time, and he was the second in command. And they raised the regiment in just 6 months, which in itself was fairly extraordinary. And they were first their first job was to guard the oil fields in North Assam at Digboy. And at Christmas that year, a message came through on Christmas Day, a message came through which my grandfather handed to Colonel Lyman, and he said, "You're not going to like the news, sir." And he didn't. Colonel Lyman didn't like the news at all. He'd received a brilliant promotion. Sadly, though, it meant he'd have to leave the regiment and go to Delhi. He tried really hard to get out of that promotion. He didn't want to leave the regiment, but he was too important. It was too important a job. So with great regret, he left the regiment. And perhaps some of that sadness was mollified by the fact that he knew he was handing over to his second in command, Brown. So this is my grandfather. He became the commanding officer very late December 41, and they then were still in the oil fields at Digboy. They were guarding those oil fields. They were also surveying out into the jungles there, which in fact turned out to be surveying for the Stillwell Road. They found out later that they were doing a lot of work preparing where the best places for the road to go would be. They were then sent down in late 1942 to guard Tamu, the rear guard of Alexander's army, as they withdrew in front of the Japanese out of Burma. They were sent down to Tamu, and they were guarding the rear guard of the last of the troops as they came through, and they helped with the dismantling of the last bridges. Once the army was through, they were then sent forward into enemy-occupied territory, into Burma, and they were patrolling, trying to find out where the Japanese were, where the best places for crossing rivers were, where there were any clearings. They were uniquely suited as a unit to do this because the army had recruited exclusively from the hills of this area, from northeastern India. So there were Assamese, there were Khazis, there were Misos, there were Nagas, and of course they knew the jungle and they knew how to work this territory, how to live in this territory. So it was fantastic that they could be used to do this patrolling. And that patrolling was in fact laying the groundwork for some of the Chindit operations that later were to happen. But even then, when they knew the territory so well, sadly, the Kabul Valley, where a lot of them were operating, is known as the Valley of Death. And it has so many diseases. There's typhoid and there's dengue fever. There was dysentery ran through the troops, and malaria was one of the real problems that they had. And in the end, the numbers of the Assam, they're getting so many were going sick that they were withdrawn back up to Digboy to rest and recuperate. I'm not sure how much resting and recuperating Brown allowed them, because he had them out marching. He had them practicing marching at night so that they could cover long distances. He was trying to get them up to about 33 miles a night, which turned out to be extremely helpful. But I'm not sure many people knew that at the time, or indeed perhaps appreciated it at the time. But in early 1944, they got their call up to the front line. They were asked to move in February 44 to Kohima. So they went to Dimapur. They got into Dimapur, and many of them were given their rifles for the very first time in Dimapur. So whilst they'd been practicing in Digboy, many of them were literally using sticks. They did not have the equipment to go around. So this is when they first got their weapons. And they moved from Dimapur up into Kohima. And on the 22nd of February, they were in Kohima, about to set off for the villages of Jessami, Karasom, out further to the east. Sir Charles Pawsey, the Deputy Commissioner of Kohima, Nagaland, he held a drinks party that night on the 22nd of February for the Assam, the officers of the Assam Regiment, as a good luck and a bon voyage to them all. And Brown ordered all of his men to attend in full battle dress. Apparently this was very like him. He always behaved as if the enemy were at the door, and lots of people gave him some stick about it, gently teased him about it. And people said it reminded them, this particular drinks party that Pawsey had, it reminded them of Duchess of Richmond's ball the night before Waterloo, as the men were there in their uniforms, ready to go off to battle. And so they did. the next morning, they set off for Jessami, Karasom. The first units were A Company under a gentleman called Jock Young. We will come back to him. And they set off in transport for the first 10 miles, then they had to march the rest themselves. It took them about a week to get out to Jessami, and A Company then moving forward into Karasom. They were under the command of Jock Young. He was not actually a Assam Regiment. He was attached to them from the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. And this is the sort of territory that they were moving through. These are the Naga Hills, or mountains, as I prefer to call them, jungle-clad as well. Utterly stunning, very difficult to move through. There was one motorable track between Jessami and Karasom. And this was the sort of territory that they were moving through. And when they arrived in Jessami and Karasom, they started digging. Again, my grandfather was given quite a lot of ridicule about the fact that he was digging. He seemed to be treating this as if there was a real threat that the Japanese were going to be coming through this area. And they were not sent there, the Assam, to fight. They were sent there to patrol and information gather. That's how they were supposed to be being used. So people were amused that Brown decided that they should build such strong defences. They were not going to be used. But how right he was and how wrong they were, because this is exactly where the Japanese came through and the Assam stood in their way. They sent out lots of patrols. Brown sent out lots of patrols, as did Young from Karasom, to try and establish what the local villagers knew. Had they seen any movements? Were there any movements of Japanese in the area? And actually it was on the 25th of March that a Lieutenant Lloyd Jones, with his small patrol, about 3 days march from Jessami, first bumped a patrol of the Japanese, a forward patrol of the Japanese. And it was the start of a column that was coming across the hills towards Kohima. He immediately sent back runners to Jessami to warn them. And Brown immediately sent reinforcements to support Lloyd Jones, and they alerted Karasom as well to the approaching threat. The support to Lloyd Jones arrived, but it was an overwhelming amount of Japanese that were there, and they all ended up having to withdraw. Karasom and Jessami were already being sort of surrounded, and so they ended up going via lots of different routes and villages to another village close to Jessami called Feck, where there was a garrison that had come under my grandfather's command there. And again, it was quite lucky that that's where they ended up, but it took them about a week to get to Feck. Meanwhile, that's at Mulhay. So here's Jessami, and here is the area around Mulhay where they first bumped the Japanese. Then we move to Karasom. So this is the perimeter. This is the map of Karasom. This is the perimeter, a very useful place where 2 tracks were coming into the hills. And so Young chose his spot extremely well. He had been alerted to the possibility of the Japanese coming towards him, and indeed they did. And 9 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of March, Young called back to Brown on the communication systems and said that they were preparing to fight the first echelons of the Japanese who were coming up the track. After that, all communications went dead with Karasom, so no further messages could get in or out. And indeed, the Japanese came, and Young, with his A Company, fought there bravely for 3 days and 3 nights against overwhelming numbers of Japanese coming in to them, keeping coming up the track at them. But they held firm and really didn't suffer many casualties at all. Sadly, Young's second in command was killed very early on in the first day. On the 3rd day, from an observation spot that they had, Young was called up to view what was coming down the track at them, and it was another enormous phalanx of Japanese, another column with artillery and elephants. And Young realized that this was going to be an impossible task. They were going to be overwhelmed. It was going to be a complete waste of life. Now, their orders, this was the orders that Brown had received, and of course Brown had given to Young. Their orders, whilst they should have been patrolling, but they had this extraordinary order at the end of that, which was that they should remain in their positions to the last man and to the last bullet. So these were his orders. and yet he saw that it was going to be a total waste of life. So what he decided to do was to call a conference of his men, and he ordered them to remove themselves, withdraw back onto Kohima. He felt that it would be a total waste of their lives. They were going to be overwhelmed. But he said, however, my orders are to remain to the last man, and so I shall be the last man. He's 24 years old, and he's attached to the Assam Regiment. Extraordinary bravery. Now, his men questioned him, and he said very firmly, apparently in Urdu, which was the language of the regiment, it's a very firm, it's an order. It comes across extremely abruptly. And so they knew that he meant everything that he had said. And he then added, it would also not be right of me to leave the wounded. So his men prepared to withdraw back on Kohima. He went back to the bunkers, and as they looked back, they saw him piling up ammunition, gathering the wounded together into one place, and preparing to face the final onslaught. And later that day, as they left, they heard the guns firing, they heard mortars, they heard machine guns, and then everything went quiet. My grandfather put Jock Young forward for a VC for his bravery. Very sadly, he wasn't granted that, it wasn't awarded. Now, I understand from those who know military things better than I, that in order to be eligible for a VC, you need to have been witnessed by a superior officer performing your bravery. Now, in this instance, the only more senior officer at the time would have been Brown, and he was rather busy himself defending Jessami from the Japanese. It would have been impossible for him to have witnessed it. But sadly, no exceptions have been made. And so whilst he may not have VC in his after his name on his grave or in other records, to me, he is absolutely deserving of the ultimate award for bravery. And here we were able to lay a wreath to him and to the other Assam who lost their lives, as well as the Japanese who lost their lives. This is actually Karasom. This is the perimeter that they were defending, a flat-topped hill, where, in fact, lovely family let us come onto their land. They've got two houses of either side now. And just behind, you can see the raised area. That was where the forward observation posts were, where they saw the larger number of Japanese coming down the track at them. And this is looking out from Karasom back towards Kohima. This is the direction that the withdrawing A company would have taken. Again, no picnic for them trying to get back through there. There was no motorable roads across this territory. You can see at the bottom here, this is the top of a banana tree. It's actually quite a large banana plant. It just shows you how quickly the land disappears down the sides, how steep these sides are. Meanwhile, back at Jessami, things were unfortunately getting somewhat more difficult there as well. So the Japanese reached Jessami on the 28th of March, and they were well prepared in Jessami, but they were then being attacked by an overwhelming force. When they'd been preparing their positions, they'd actually used an area just south of their final perimeter. They called it a bivouac area, which is where they sort of spent the nights whilst during the day preparing their final perimeter. So when the message from Mulhay came back, they moved themselves from the bivouac area into their final perimeter area. And a lot of these defences, very well prepared, are still visible today in Jessami, and indeed can be enjoyed by some military historians. So here we have Rob investigating one of the trenches at Jessami.
Come on, Royal Marine.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is quite a... Here's your rifle. Here we are. Okay. Covering that. Amazing, isn't it? Look at this. Actually, it's
there we are. You've heard from a military man himself, a very good position. But there were the trenches all being prepared. So they were busy fighting. And as I mentioned before, there was also a garrison at a village called Fek, which came under his command. They weren't attacked at this point, but we did feel when we went out this time that we must go and visit Fek. And oh, there we are. Here we are at Fek, being welcomed by the council. We received the most extraordinary welcome wherever we went. The Nagas were so delighted to have us with them. They couldn't have been more hospitable. We were treated like royalty. And again, that reflects the loyalty that they showed 80 years ago to the British as well. Without the Nagas, Kohima would not have been a success for the Allies. They were incredible. And so this was actually Easter Day. We came to Fek and were treated to an extraordinary feast and songs and dances, as well as stories from people who had lived in Fek and who had been veterans themselves of the Second World War. And here is one of these gentlemen we were told about, Sevehu Nenyu, who is in fact of the 1st Assam Regiment. And they very kindly told his story, but then gave us a copy of his biography as well. And this was very much a theme throughout our experiences on this trip and during the walk. The villages, not only were they welcoming, but they wanted to share the stories that they had of the veterans and their villages' involvement in the battle in helping the Assam and helping the British and the Allies. Going back to 80 years ago, in fact, we had a number of the Assam Regiment who had tried to go and support Lloyd Jones at Mulhay, hadn't been able to, and they had all withdrawn onto this village called Fek. Around this time, we're now on about the 31st of March, the orders to my grandfather had been changed. They had been changed to, please can you withdraw on Kohima, if you don't mind. That would be jolly nice of you, please. Unfortunately, all communications with Jessami and Kohima, but between Jessami and Kohima, or Jessami at all, and Karasom, had been cut. So Brown was unaware of the change of the order. Whilst the Assam Regiment were, odds and sods, were gathering at Fek, the information officer came out from Kohima and was relaying to whomever he could find the order had been changed to withdraw on Kohima. So he was requiring that the Fek garrison withdraw on Kohima. Now, a number of the Assam were surprised by this and asked about Jessami. Was that included in this change of order? And they said, yes, 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 they know, we've told them. They said, I don't know if you have, because we can see down there that they're fighting, and they wouldn't be fighting like this if they'd had this order, they've received this order change. And they said, no, 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 we sent an aircraft and it dropped a message. And they went, oh, is that the aircraft we saw a few hours ago, dropping the message on the old bivouac area? And I went, yes, that'll be the one. I said, well, that old bivouac area now is invested with the Japanese. So this message, was it dropped in code? No, it was dropped in clear. Right. So it turns out that they had tried to get a message through, but unfortunately, they had dropped a message in clear on the Japanese with Brown's new orders to withdraw. Brown was totally unaware. The Japanese were now totally aware of the plans and set about ambushing every single track in the area. One of the lieutenants of the Assam Regiment at Fek said, on such a matter as this, I think it is important we check whether Brown at Jessami has received this order or whether it did fall on the Japanese. So he asked permission to try to get the message through, to go and check himself. And he was granted permission. And so that evening, as the rest of the garrison were moving out of Fek back on Kohima, he and his orderly with a revolver went down the hill from Jessami, the very steep hill, jungle-clad hill, to try to get a message into Brown. He climbed down to the bottom of the hill. He then had to climb all the way back up the other side through the dark, through enemy-held territory. And when he came out, he found himself, in fact, in the old bivouac area, which was indeed invested by the Japanese. Thankfully, they were all asleep and they were not very alert. And so he was able to get out from his mistake of getting into the wrong part of the perimeter without being seen. He then went back down the hill and across a little bit to come back up into what he hoped was going to be the perimeter of the Assam. And indeed it was. Unfortunately for him, the Assam sentries were significantly more alert than the Japanese, and so they started firing at him. That then led to the Japanese firing, and all mayhem broke out for a little while. When it calmed down a little bit, Corlett was busy trying to shout to the Assam to say, "It's Corlett, don't fire at me, I need to come into the perimeter." And of course he was shouting this in English. And the Assam sentries had been told about the tricks that the GIFs would play, and that they would call out in English to try and make the soldiers open up the perimeter. And so they totally ignored all these pleas from Corlett, thinking that perhaps he was actually an enemy calling out in English. But there was, thankfully, he kept persisting and he kept persisting. And eventually they relented. They let him into the perimeter. And the reason that they relented was they recognized Corlett because of his lisp. He sadly had a speech impediment, but the Assam soldiers recognized it from the parade ground, and as a result, he was allowed into the perimeter. Just a remarkable stroke of luck. So here we are. This is actually the memorial at Jessami, which is on the perimeter area, on the battalion headquarters part of the Jessami perimeter. But actually, for poor Corlett, he got into the perimeter, but he hadn't got to battalion headquarters. And as the situation was so dire and difficult at Jessami, the order had come about that there was to be no movement above ground at night. And therefore, one could assume if something was moving above ground at night, it was Japanese and needed to be shot. So poor Corlett had to keep calling and keep dodging bullets in order to get his way into Brown's battalion headquarters. Eventually, he did, quite close to midnight. Again, Brown gave him a very hard time too, because he didn't believe these withdrawal orders, and he questioned Corlett very closely. When finally he realized he needed to prepare a withdrawal, it was too late to do anything that night. The situation was already too difficult in the box. But the next morning, he called a conference of men and said that they were going to withdraw back on Kohima as per the original orders, but just 24 hours later. So at midnight that night, they were to withdraw in two columns, one under Major Canistan, one under Brown, both going down either side of the ridge sort of an east-west ridge where Jessami sits. And they were to leave at midnight. So that was the plan at the beginning of the day, an organized withdrawal. But unfortunately, the Japanese on this fifth day of fighting by now, perhaps because they thought that maybe a message had got to them, perhaps they just wanted to give it one last go, but they threw everything they had at the Jessami box. And of course, after 5 days and nights of complete fighting, the Assam Regiment were tiring and getting very weary indeed, and indeed short of food and ammunition as well, and water. There was no water in the actual box itself. They prepared enough food and water for 5 days just, but it was getting very tricky. And eventually, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a hole opened in the eastern sector of the Jessami perimeter. And Brown realized that that was going to be the perfect point for the Japanese to come in as soon as it got dark and overwhelm them. So he personally crawled around to any trench that he could get to and to change the orders and ordered the men to leave as and when they could disengage as soon as it got dark. And that's what he did. And he then went back to battalion headquarters, started destroying documents and supplies. Eventually, he was able to leave around about midnight. And so for the men of the Assam, this is what they faced, trying to get back to Kohima, 77 miles up and down, trying to get back into Kohima, having fought for 5 days and nights, taking nothing with them. They had nothing left, with the Japanese very much hot on their heels. And this is what we decided was a really good idea, to try and replicate this. And so 1st of April, here we were, we found ourselves out at Jessami. This is my talking to the families of 2 Assam veterans. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, the 1st of April. It was a very long day for me. Up to say goodbye to them. They had to go back to their towns. They had actually travelled halfway across India to come and see us because they wanted to share the stories of their fathers, of whom they were extremely proud, with us. Sadly, we could not spend any longer with them. They had to go home again. So it was incredible that they wanted to come and share this with them. The gentleman here on our left in the picture, his father was a clerk, and he was telling us how, despite not having been trained in weapons at all, his father had to learn very quickly how to use one in order to protect himself. This gentleman here told a lovely story about how his father was recruited into the Assam Regiment, which was as a result of Brown watching him play football, and that I can believe, actually. He then stayed throughout. He was recruited into the Assam. He stayed alongside Brown throughout. And this, the family story is that it was his father who caught my grandfather when he was shot in January 1945 in Burma. So they were particularly keen to come and meet us. And it was humbling that they made that journey just to come and spend a few hours with us. And here we are about to set off. This is our final briefing about 11 o'clock before setting off at midnight. Our final briefing. Has everybody got the right boots, all the right kit? You've got everything you need. People are starting to look a bit nervous. It had all been quite fun up till then, and suddenly the reality of it, I think, started to hit us all. And here's our last supper as we gathered finally before the event. And again, this is all laid out brilliantly by people in Jessami, as everywhere along the route where we were given incredible food, brilliant food, to keep us going through the walk. Here we are, my three very, very keen volunteer children, bless them. And it was all about, not all about, it was all about remembrance, but also making sure that that younger generation were going to know the stories as well. I'm so grateful for them to coming along. They are very good sports with them. And this is a lovely group who had come via one of the other Kohima Educational Trust trustees, Angus. These are dear friends of his from his time in the Far East, and all of whom are keen walkers who actually knew what they were doing, thank God. They were wonderful to have on board, and we were extremely grateful for their expertise. Now, when we were at Jessami, we were able to establish from the oral histories of the villages there exactly where the Assam Regiment left the perimeter. And it's over the side of this hill here, which from the other side, when you're down below, looks something like this. Pretty steep, pretty vertical really, jungle, no track at all. And I had been wanting to try to replicate Brown's route as accurately as possible. So I looked into seeing how possible it might be to go down this slope. But Bertie vetoed my plan and said, we're not doing that. And I'm sure he's absolutely right. And so instead, we've started off from the Jessami Memorial itself, right from the battalion headquarters. And this is us setting off.
Thank you.
Yay, Charlotte!
Welcome, Des, sweetheart. Thank you.
And here are the cars. Now, we had this extraordinary convoy of cars to get us about. We had 16 cars moving around Nagaland. It was quite a sight. And one of the ways that we had been trying to make sure the walk was accessible for everybody is that these vehicles were going to be with us as much as possible during the walk. They would go from checkpoint to checkpoint. We could put our kit in them, our blister packs in them. And if we wanted to take our clothes, we can put them in there. If you need to put clothes back on as it got cooler, we could do that. And so this is the convoy as it set off behind us, having left Jessami itself. Oh bother. So that's the convoy going down the hill. And indeed, where the first point that we get to is Jessami Bridge or Lanier Bridge at the bottom of the hill here on the map. And this is what it looks like. This is the original Bailey Bridge that Brown and his men would have been trying to get across. And it was indeed exactly where the one of the ambushes was set. We of course went on the bridge just off the camera here to our left when we were walking, but this is where Brown was. And in fact, the adjutant of the battalion left a description of the fighting here at the bridge. So Michael Williamson left actually with Major Calistan's group of around about 50, and he went straight over the precipitous side of the hill. On the eastern side of the perimeter, fighting was still going on. His group rushed the road below, which is the road that we were walking along, the road that those cars were going along, and got down to the Lanya River. Sadly, poor old Williamson fell down headfirst into a nullah, one of the ditches, and he lost his rifle. He was looking for it for some time, but when he eventually had to give up, he found that the others had gone on and he was alone. And he recalls that the sounds of battle were coming from the direction of the bridge, where the main battalion column under Brown were fighting their way through a pre-prepared ambush, literally here. Williamson continues that alone and unarmed, he didn't feel up to braving half the Japanese army as it seemed to him. So he went the other way, hopelessly lost. He actually met up with a couple of other Assam support JWARs. They got together and decided to try and cross the river, deep and treacherous as it was. Apparently it was a bright moonlit night which played on the icy waters as they floundered across, and then they climbed the hill opposite until they could move no further. So this is just an idea that these poor soldiers, having got out, they had to be fighting their way through the ambushes as well as they were going along. Dawn broke the next morning for our walk, which was lovely. And this is breakfast, our breakfast checkpoint. People still coming in, other people had already got there. We received our sustenance before going on to the next stage of the journey. And here we are, taking a quick rest, taking the boots off. Rob's advice, take the boots off each stop. And the gentleman here on my right is the head of the Czechoslovakian People's Organization. And he came along with the walk. And this is what we found, that the Nagas would come from one village, sort of supporting us to the next village. And then they would return and hand us over, as it were, to the next villages. And it was wonderful. And without the CPO's support, we needed their permission to go through their lands. And they wholeheartedly supported us. It was fantastic. And so we're extremely grateful to them as well. Here are some more of our walkers the next morning. These are the Walker Munros. So the name would give it away. They walk very well and they're very used to hills. And they set a cracking pace, leading us all the whole way back. They were amazing and magnificent. And their connection to the whole idea is that Jock and Sophie, two young great-grandchildren of Colonel Howman, the first commanding officer of the Assam Regiment. So it's fantastic that we actually had great-grandchildren there as well. And Ewan himself was up for this because he's an ex-Marine, so we're extremely grateful for his grit and determination as well. And you can see we have our marvellous guides with us too. Each group, each party had a guide, and they helped us along the way. They were magnificent. Next stop at lunchtime was at Jessami, big lunch. We had stops in between, but we had some bigger stops as well around the main meal times. And each time we went to, we received information about what the villagers had done during the war. And here, the council of the village shared with us a letter that a Canadian airman's family had written, a letter of thanks to the village for the care that they gave to their father, who was a Canadian airman who'd been downed in the hills during the Second World War, and they had taken him in and looked after him. And it's lovely that the family had written to thank the village, and this was a treasured memory that they wanted to share with us. A little later in the afternoon, I think this was at the high point of the high point in terms of actual altitude, perhaps the low point for me in terms of walking, at the town of Fitzero, which is our highest point. And this is the Slims. This is Rufus and Betty Slim, the great-grandchildren of course, Field Marshal Slim, who was the commander of the 14th Army. His grandson, Mark, was also there. He started off on the walk and then he had a few rests, but the boys kept going. They were with Rob, and you can see Rob just sneaking in here. And we have Rufus, and we have Billy, and just behind we also have Solly Slim, their cousin as well, who were part of Rob's particular grouping. So fantastic to have them coming as well. And here we are, walking in the hills. And when you were broken, when you did need a rest, we had set it up so that the cars would be there to help us. And so this is actually my team, my 3 children who for various reasons needed to have a rest at this point. And that's exactly what these cars were there for. And that's why I put this slide in to show that whenever you needed to have a rest, to make sure it was safe, you could go on to go and have a sleep in the hotel, you could just have a sleep in the car, whatever you needed to do, the cars were there to help you. That did mean I needed to change teams, and so I was extremely fortunate to be adopted by the amazing Team D. That's Angus and Alan and Ron, who were just extraordinary. Their experience as experienced walkers definitely got me through. Without them, I would not have made it round. They were extraordinary. You can see this is sort of evening time now on that 2nd of April, beginning to start getting very tired. And as we started descending into Kohima later, the night had fallen. It was spectacular as we walked down. You could see the lights of Kohima beneath us as we walked down to it. And then we were met on the road by some of the villagers who took us into another amazing feast for supper time in the church there. And it was wonderful. The story that the Kohima village council shared with us was how this seemed to replicate so perfectly how the Assam Regiment came through the village 80 years ago. They were coming in 2s and 3s and 4s, and the villagers would be meeting them and bringing them into the village. So it's nice to think that we were replicating that as closely as we were. Now, you might think that this is a particularly bad photograph, and why on earth have I included it? I included it because now it's nighttime on that second night, and this is pretty much perfectly sums up what was going through my brain at the time. Scrambled, really hard getting through that second night. Again, those who are experienced in these long distance ultra challenge style things said it would be difficult then. Absolutely, that's when I was really struggling, and that's very much how my brain was at the time. And here we are, the next day, still walking. Still walking. Does look flatter than it really was. Walking. And walking. Finally, there's a sign. 22 kilometers to Kohima. I can't tell you how happy I was. And then my mind started going through 22 kilometers is still actually half a marathon, which wasn't very helpful in my mind. But it was so exciting to see this Kohima sign and start clicking down to the actual town itself. And you could see it in the distance as we kept walking that morning, but it never seemed to get any closer. I love this picture of Rob because you can see that he's actually out on a Sunday stroll. Some of us were in lycra with our walking sticks and with our electrolyte solutions. Others, frankly, were just missing the dog. I just thought that that's summed it up, really, of different approaches that we all took, and yet we all seem to make it round. And here we are, and this is Team D coming in that final hill. Again, this doesn't look very steep, but I promise you it was certainly after 39 hours or 35 hours of walking. This is quite steep. This is coming up to the penultimate checkpoint. We decided that at the last checkpoint, and here is Rob and his team, his son Finn here as well, and there's Mark joining them again. At this penultimate checkpoint, we all gathered together. So everybody who got in over the different sort of times, we all stayed there and waited for everybody to get to that point so that we could make that last stretch into Kohima Cemetery together. And so the last leg was just 4 kilometers. What a greeting we had. Kohima went all out to greet us. We had security. They closed roads for us. We were walked the entire way. in a sort of a convoy. We met so many amazing people all the way in. What a reception we received. Simply incredible to receive that sort of warmth. And this is the end, coming in to the cemetery itself, and beautifully kept Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery at Kohima, walking in up the hill. And here I am. I sort of brought up the rear, so I was the last one coming up into the cemetery. Obviously running still in adrenaline. There's a smile there under that hat. Quite incredible what we seem to achieve, but just beginning to dawn on us, I think, perhaps what we had managed to do. This is a jumper, and obviously this is a jumper. Sorry, the reason behind this being a jumper is when Brown came in to Kohima in that afternoon, Richard wrote about how it was the highlight for him at the siege, because at the time he was manning a garrison which had very few trained soldiers in it, and he had the Japanese army approaching him. The only known soldiers vaguely coming towards him were hopefully the Assam, but nobody knew exactly where they were, because no one even knew for sure if they'd got the order to withdraw. So when they were seen marching strongly up towards Kohima, this was seen as an absolute highlight for Richard. It must have been a huge relief. I'm not sure I was marching strongly. I was more sort of staggering that final section. But the Assam were marching in strongly, according to the records. Interestingly, they were also spotted by the RAF marching strongly towards Kohima. And the RAF thought that they were the Japanese approaching Kohima, and sadly strafed them with fire as a final sort of thank you. And so they managed to dodge that as well in order to get into the perimeter. When they did get into the perimeter, they were in a bit of a state, as you can imagine. They'd been fighting for 5 days and nights. They'd then had to fight their way through ambushes as well, and they'd done this continuous walk to get back in to Kohima. And Charles Pawsey was with Richards at the time, and Pawsey saw my grandfather, the state that he was in, and it so moved him, he wrote, that he went down to his bungalow and he got a jumper and he gave it to Brown, and Brown wore it throughout the siege. So as a result, he decided to make up some jumpers for those who were doing the walk for the 39 hours, hence the jumper. It was then at the end of the walk, there was a press conference, which was wonderful. And it was wonderful, but you would have thought I would have perhaps prepared some words, been aware that I should have maybe had a few things to say. Hadn't. And after being up for about 50 hours without sleeping, goodness knows what I actually said. But again, how important it was to the locals came across. We were extremely well received. They were very keen to hear the story and share their stories. Wherever we went, lots of people wanted to hear what we were doing, what it was all about. Now, fingers crossed that this is going to work. Otherwise, I'm going to have to play around with it, because this, I think, is so cool. This is a fitness app that a friend very kindly told me about, which measures all sorts of clever things and records them as you're walking. I did it for almost all the walk. I forgot, of course, just as we were starting off. But I'm hoping it's going to work if I click here. Fingers crossed. Oh, look, it's looking good. So here we are, setting off from Jessami. The Last Supper. Down the hill towards Lanya Bridge. And along through the night. This would have been when we were walking through the night. If you look here on the top left as well, you start to get the idea of the elevations that we were dealing with as well. Here we are, the next day. I kept trying to remember,
Charlotte, the app's not coming through onto the webinar, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Right, well, I'll tell you what.
You know.
Right, well, thank you. I'm going to do it another way then. I'm going to stop sharing the screen because it's so good. If you don't mind, bear with. I'm going to see if I can get it up.
I'm going to upload it to the chat as well.
Oh, fantastic. I'm never defeated. I just keep pressing buttons and hope. Let's see. Share the sound. Well, there's no sound on this. Is that sharing? Is that sharing?
Yes,
Sylvia?
it is.
That's
Yes,
sharing. Yep.
Let's try and play this one.
Oh, now it's working.
Fantastic.
Now it's working.
Probably lost my place in the other slides, but I will figure that out in a minute. This is us walking through the night by this point. And then we're coming out. I kept trying to remember to take photographs, but my mind was busy with one foot in front of the other. But trying to give an idea of where we were, how high we were going, some of the terrain that we were encountering. This is Jessami, where the Canadian airman was looked after. That was our lunchtime stop. Another wonderful view. That was Fitzero, the highest point. And we had another sort of high tea, I suppose, there, quite literally high tea. This is all downhill at night. It was not nearly as easy as it looks. It was so hard. It was, frankly, I think we were walking through a ginormous quarry downhill with all the lorries. There's our fantastic sign, nearly there. And yet those are the longest 22 kilometers I've ever encountered. Here we are, sort of stop but one before the finish. And then this is that final penultimate checkpoint for that final 4 kilometers into the cemetery itself. And this perhaps gives a little bit of an idea of the magnitude of what we undertook. Right, excuse me whilst I stop sharing screens and try and pull it back up again to the right place. Oh, bother. Oh, definitely bother. Let me see if I go from here. I'm not sure I even want to show you the next photograph. Right, anyway, I'll be brave. I may just have to put it onto the screen. Up here. Start from beginning, not really. Let's see if I can go from this slide. Let's do it. I'm going to start from the beginning and click madly. Excuse me. Won't be defeated. Told you I press lots of buttons. We are there. That's the photograph I wasn't sure I wanted to share with you all. This was a before and after that my children thought was going to be a really good idea. Now, the reason for the hair is because of that quarry. The dust that was kicking up when I took my hat off. I just think it was a remarkably funny photograph. And I thought this is what you look like after 39 hours of walking non-stop. This is what everybody else looked like at the end as well. This is the group photo at the end, a big smiles. We achieved it. It was quite a thing. This is our guides and our drivers all with us as well, who share absolutely in the same deserving praise of having made it through the whole thing. It was fantastic. And this is what it was all about. Remembering them all. So the Kohima epitaph, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today, and we are trying to raise awareness of the Forgotten Army and those who fought in the battle in the Forgotten Army in the Burma theatre of war. And when we were, now it's decided to stop again. When we were at the cemetery in Kohima, we had the opportunity to visit the graves of the 5 Assam men who are buried there. I have, when it's going to let me, there we are. The graves of 5 Assam men. Now this is Zapu with me. He is our guide. He's from the Angami tribe, and this particular grave is an Angami. Oh, it doesn't want to do it. I'm so sorry, everyone. This is the grave from the Angami tribe, and the inscription says, "Beloved son, you will return as a star." And I thought that was just so moving. Also in the cemetery, we have Jok Young's grave as well. Jok Young from the Assam, from the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, who was attached to the Assam Regiment, killed, saving his men's life. The A Company, all of A Company owe their lives to Jock Young, getting those men back to Kohima to help defend Kohima. He was aged just 24, and for me, he definitely deserves a VC. And then this gentleman, Subadar Thansea, he actually was at Jessami with my grandfather. I found out about him as we were leaving to go out to India, that he found out about his existence. And I thought, right, as soon as we finish the walk, I'm jumping on a plane. He lives in the Mizoram state, and I was going to jump over and go and see him. But very sadly, he died on the 31st of March, aged just 102. So I was extremely unfortunate to have missed that incredibly humbling privilege to have gone to have met him. So we remember people such as Subadar Thansea as well, and Talgravaho is the Assam greeting of be strong. And then, of course, my grandfather himself, Colonel William Felix Brown, Bruno Brown. We remember him as well. I do hope that our walk made him proud. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Charlotte. That was a terrific presentation and a brilliant achievement. You and all the walkers were just immense, completing a grueling distance, as you said, 3 marathons without sleep and very little rest. It was a really incredible achievement. Well done. And thank you also, of course, to all the Nagas who made it possible, as you've said, and to organise. We also had a wonderful service in Kohima on the 4th of April to remember those as the siege started exactly 80 years ago. We had a lovely wreath laying, and children, some of our friends in Kohima had organised a lot of school children to come and lay wreaths, and of course we all did as well. But it was very, very moving, very simple, and yeah, lovely. So we are back. We've got our next webinar next week already. We've got 2 coming up very quickly. Next week is going to be Steve Snelling talking about the role of the Royal Norfolks in the Battle of Kohima. And I also, when I was in Kohima, took the opportunity to do lots of shopping along with my sister. So we've restocked the shop, and hopefully you'll be able to get onto the website where we'll, as I say, hopefully have it all up online for you. And again, we've got our annual York service coming up. I know a lot of you have booked, but we're looking forward to seeing you there. And if you haven't booked, do so before it all books. We'd love to see you there. Otherwise, next week, have a good evening, and thank you very much. Bye for now.